Thank you, Selena. And let me just start by saying a big thank you to the Global Forum on Democratizing Work. And also a big thank you to SBF and Neera Chandok for organizing this. I must say that this is a powerful idea. And this is an idea on which we have not had enough conversations. Can I request my co-panelists to mute their lines? There's some hissing sound that I hear. So yeah, so let me start. We are starting late, so I'll try and kind of reduce the comments that I had. But let me start on a grim note. And this grim note is we've all experienced it, but the heart-wrenching journey that we saw of the migrant workers last year, absolutely heart-wrenching. Uh, People walking thousands of kilometers bare feet, 42, 44-degree centigrade, often without food or water, and they were still made to face police brutalities. Very often, the police was, instead of helping them, actually caning them. And they had to then leave the main roads and try and find alternative paths to reach where they wanted to reach. It was fairly clear that what we were seeing is the complete failure of our entire system, particularly these migrant labor did not have any kind of social security, no job security, no contractual security, and that was one of the reasons why they were going back. So that's scene one. Taking you just a year later, equally heart wrenching, I would say, probably even more painful. We did see, as in this phase, I had my own friends literally dying, waiting at hospital reception just for an oxygen cylinder. And that's what we saw, and it was not just unique to me. Sadly, pretty much everyone in this country knows someone personally who lost his or her life during this second phase of the pandemic. And what it reflected was a complete collapse of the public health system. The doctors and the nurses, the paramedics did a fantastic job as individuals. But it was fairly clear that as a health system, we were not able to cope with it. And what became even more evident, that the much tom-tommed insurance model of health was a complete failure. It just did not address the needs of common people, certainly not of the poor and marginalized. And that's what we saw. But it is, I would say, interesting that tough questions have not been asked of the government at all. Questions about why public health is underfunded. Why are we moving from a public health system to a privatized health system? There have been very little questions around this. I find it really surprising. Apart from few passionate appeals, one that stands out in my mind is Professor Manoj Jha, Member of Parliament, speaking for the right to health. But largely, it's really not been a conversation point. And what I think is more worrying, that now it seems as if people have politically forgotten the issue. That's the big worry. And is it happening? Because a lot of people are writing about it, and what I notice, and that finds resonance, the argument, and I think that's one of the central questions for our panel, that probably it's a triumph of the neoliberal vision, in which people have started believing that health is not the responsibility of the state. It's not a right and entitlement, and it's their responsibility to find health support, health services, and that's what it seems like. Why are they not angry? Is the question that comes, and this is the argument that we hear. What I also think is very, very depressing. I thought was I talked of the migrant crisis, and that's the time when the hard fought and won labor rights, won over decades of struggles, were pretty much exactly at the same time they were being dismantled. And again, there was not much criticism happening apart from the regular criticism in the public domain. It seemed that it was all right. Even it was so ironic. It was almost like black humor. But people, the government, and several states actually went ahead with dismantling, diluting the labor rights, particularly at that moment. So I just wanted to bring these two, three: the lack of social contract, social security for the informal sector worker, how we have not looked at health as a fundamental right, how hard fought rights which are pretty much vested rights are being diluted. So I just wanted to go back and reflect on what does it reflect on the social contract that we have. The social contract, which clearly so powerfully enshrined in our constitution, which talks of us as rights-bearing citizens, including the directive principles. But what we are seeing is actually shrinking of that right space. We would have ordinarily assumed that there is expansion and deepening of these rights. But what we are seeing is actually truncating of these rights, the right space, the rights discourse. So, I think that's a question that I want us to probe. Why is this happening? And more importantly, how can we reverse that trend? Let me just say a few more things. One of the things I would say, and in this conversation, yes, we are aware that at the moment, civil political rights are hugely under challenge. But I think that the economic, social, cultural rights are also equally under threat. And in this conversation, if we can focus on that, I think it would be important. And I do agree, and that's again something that I wanted to flag, that we all talk about indivisibility of rights, the interdependence of rights. But somewhere probably we looked at much more of the socio-economic rights. So I'm just also reflecting back. The three of you, I will certainly introduce you when I request you to speak. But you have been absolute champions of many of these rights, and you played very important roles. Or maybe I should actually introduce you at this moment. So Harsh Mander, author, activist, president of the Center for Equity Studies, founder of Karma and Mohabbat, and he does multiple roles. But in this context, let me also say he was a member of the National Advisory Council. So welcome, Harshji, and I'll move on with more of my comments, questions. But let me also welcome Mr. Raju. Mr. Raju again played a very, very important role in this entire expansion of rights, golden era, the decade that saw several rights become real. And Mr. Raju comes from the administrative services, was the secretary of the NAC, and currently works with the Indian National Congress. So again, welcome, Mr. Raju. And Nikhil is one of the foremost voices of civil society, works with Majdoor Kisan Shakti Sangathan, with the National Campaign for Right to Information, also part of the Suchna and Rozgar Adhikar Andolan. Nikhil, I hope I got it right. And Nikhil was playing such an important role in actually articulating the demands from the people to ensure that those rights are converted into rights, which were demands then. So the three of you have played such an important role in this. So, this at this juncture, the what I've talked of how rights are getting now truncated, shrinking space. So, one big question that I wanted to ask you is that were we naive in focusing so much on the socioeconomic rights, but not adequately looking at the macroeconomic structures? Because on the other hand, there was such massive rise of neoliberalism happening post 90s. And I work on inequality. We know how obscene levels inequality has reached. At least one data that I keep using because that's so powerful, that 2 years ago 9 people in India had more wealth than 50% of the Indian population, which would be around 650 million people. So how do we actually address this question? So there, one is that this move from rights-bearing citizens to consumers. The second is the indivisibility of rights that I flagged. The third, that macroeconomic structures running parallel to the discourse of rights that we were talking of are the three questions that I particularly wanted to highlight. But let me just add one more, which I think is critical, that Indian Constitution is obviously talks of the three fundamental liberty, equality, and fraternity. But I think what it also adds is the notion of justice, which is so important to the entire, I would say, visualization of the Republic of India. It's central to that. And in that, particularly the Dalits, the Adivasis, the marginalized, the Muslims, the minorities are also at the center of this discourse around particularly social justice. But if we look at, again, the question of rights, as an Oxfam did a survey during COVID too, and the people coming from marginalized communities had 5 times worse experience than people coming from upper caste in terms of just accessing healthcare. And there's enough data. We know the huge gaps, whether you look at the right to education. So upper caste male and between the upper caste male and the say the Adivasi women, there would be still 20 to 25% difference in terms of literacy rate itself. So that's the level of difference. And it is very clear that these marginalized communities do need the state to deliver the promise of justice that we are talking of. However, what we are looking at is a dismantling of the welfare state. We are looking at dismantling of the welfare state, which initially was called, say, the regulatory state, and which, at least now, with the contours it's taken of crony capitalism, a lot of commentators are saying it's a predatory state. So in this context, how do we look at the question that we are engaging with of citizens as holders of inalienable rights? I think that's something that we need to locate. But let me just, let me end my opening comments with the fact that people's struggles continues inspiring us. And what we have seen over the last few decades, it's people's struggles which have been able to create those rights and get those entitlements. How much hope do we have with people's struggles? What do we need to do moving forward is also, I would say, a very critical question for me. So let me just stop here. The idea was that we request you to do 12 to 14 minutes, but if you can try and do it now with, say, 10 to 12 minutes, because we've lost a lot of time because of the technological challenges. So if that's all right, let me request, start with Harshji, then I'll go to Rajuji, and then Nikhil, if that's a reasonable order for all of you. Okay. Harshji.
Thank you very much. I think, in many ways, your remarks laid the ground for much of what I wanted to say. I'm glad that you started off with the present crisis created by the pandemic and our response to it. We are still in the midst of what is likely to be the gravest humanitarian crisis that most of us, except those who were alive during partition, have seen and hopefully will see in our lifetimes. Arundhati Roy spoke about COVID-19 as a virus, but she also spoke about it as an X-ray. She said it's an X-ray of the kind of society that we have. And I think that it is in this moment of this unprecedented humanitarian crisis that we need to look closely at our society, and many of the questions that we are discussing today come to very sharp focus when we look at this X-ray. There's firstly the question of inequality, but we've seen deeply unequal society, a profound absence of public compassion and of fraternity, of justice. We're seeing public policies that in their very design excluded the poor from the protections and yet placed intolerable burdens on their shoulders for massive explosion of hunger and joblessness. First, let me briefly take the question of inequality, and Amitabh and has been working, and the reports are very, very powerful. But sometimes it's said, we might be, exaggerating the importance of inequality because, say, India and China have comparable levels of inequality. But Amartya Sen reminded us that what he called the penalty of inequality is much greater in India than in China. And why is that so? It's because if I was in the bottom 10% in India compared to the bottom 10% in China, in the bottom 10% in China, I would still have access to a decent school for my child. I would still have a hospital, a public hospital where I could take my child when she falls ill. But none of that would be available to me in India. And therefore, inequality has a much greater penalty because of the failure of state provisioning of the kind that we're talking about. The inequality that we see here is also one which is characterized by what I would call a spectacular absence of caring by the elite about the suffering of working people. And I think that's one of the most traumatic lessons that we've learned from the second wave. And what Amitabh said, that the lessons are so clear, and yet already it seems that we have forgotten them, and people of relative privilege are moving ahead on the same direction that has caused such devastation. This is, I think many things that this crisis has shown, but I think if I have to prioritize a few of them, I think one of them is how critically important is labor rights and a framework of social security for all. We found 9 out of 10 workers in India are informal workers, and suddenly overnight, when the state chose to close down the entire economy, all demand, all supply, with one of the smallest relief packages in the world, the devastation that it left the working poor in, because they had no social security of any kind and job security to fall back on. And the second was the question of public health, which Amitabh referred to, and I hope to get a little time to talk about that as well. But I think the larger framework that I wanted to speak about was that the time has come for us to acknowledge how crucially important within the neoliberal framework that we have to create a framework of universal social rights. We have talked about social and economic rights, but not the entire gamut with the kind of 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 political and social consensus that is required for these. Prabhat Patnaik, one of our most respected economists, actually talks about the struggle for universal social rights as the new class struggle of our times. Uh, Even if we tangle ourselves with debates and questions about neoliberalism, about the respective role of markets and the state, I think that what has become manifest and clear is the imperative for what I call a new social contract. Um, Even if we go ahead consensually with a market-driven economic growth, although I think there's a great deal to debate about it, can we at least agree today that there should be a floor of human dignity below which no one will be allowed to fall? And this should be our new social contract. I recall, when the food security bill was being debated in Parliament, there were very few voices from the entire political spectrum, including of the Congress, which really was willing to stand up and defend the idea of the Food Security Act. Uh, and uh, and I found myself in front of television cameras every day when the act was being the bill was being debated in Parliament, and I found that everybody was enraged, including the anchors, including all the anchors, not just the ones who are normally enraged. And I couldn't understand where all of this rage was coming from. And at one point, uh, one particular industrialist, she turned to me and said, "I'm fed up. What's the problem? I've made money because I've worked hard. I've done nothing to harm the economy. Why should I be taxed to feed the poor?" And suddenly I understood where this rage was coming from. I said to her that, "I'm sorry, the poor work much harder than you. They have done far less to harm the economy. And in a good society, people of relative wealth and privilege are happy to share some of this so that life is dignified and bearable for the rest." And I recognize now that it is a moral question as a society, as a culture, that we need to ask ourselves, what is a good society? How far have we lost our way? And we need to create a framework of this kind of floor of human dignity, which we collectively resolve. No one will be allowed to fall below. The details can be worked out. No child should have to work instead of going to a decent school of equal quality to others. Everyone should have health care. Old people should not have to work till their last day until without a decent pension, and so on and so forth. The idea of labor rights, again, I think needs just a moment's discussion. We continue to hear the argument that actually labor will be better off with less protections. And the argument is that flexible labor markets will actually spur massive economic growth, which will spur massive job growth, and therefore laborers will paradoxically be better off with fewer protections. I think that argument has been manifestly broken down and shattered, most of all because the period of neoliberal economic growth in India from 2004 to 2010 in particular, and in the years that have followed, have been periods of almost jobless growth. And if jobs are not being created, young people are being added to the workforce in large numbers with no futures to look forward to. And therefore, we cannot say that workers are better off without rights. And we saw what happened to them when a calamity of the scale of a nationwide lockdown without relief hit them. It's also important to talk about legal right to work, and I know that there was some discussion about this here. An urban employment guarantee scheme backed by law is an idea of which the time has long come. Um, and we need to think about it will be very different from the rural employment guarantee. We'll have to look at things like the care economy, for instance, in a substantial way. A lot of the employment would be in the care economy, would be in ensuring basic human infrastructure for all people, social housing, clean water, drainage, sanitation in slums, and so on and so forth. And we need, of course, a public health system, one that works for all, that works best for the working poor. I think that the middle class and the elite have long opted out of all public systems because they felt secure and protected in the money that they had that could buy the best education, the best healthcare, generators in their homes, security guards outside. We don't need the state because we will buy the best for ourselves. And whatever the moral flaws of that argument, the flaws of it in practical terms actually were demonstrated during the second wave when the middle class was, as Amitabh was saying, I have never met, not yet met a single person from the middle classes who has not had somebody close to him or her in family or in work or among friends who did not struggle to get a hospital bed, struggle to get oxygen, and died because the whole system broke down. The for-profit private care system did not deliver when we really needed a health system. 80% of trained doctors in India work for the for-profit sector, and they more or less abandoned the people when they were most needed. And we need a very strong, within it, a strong primary healthcare system. Can we afford this? I know I'm running out of time. I'll just make two more points. People say we can't afford this. Where's the money for it? Of course we can afford it, and we must afford it. India's tax to GDP ratios are among the lowest in the world, and much of it is indirect taxes. We cannot afford it because we have refused to tax the rich and even less tax the super rich. That is where the pathway that we have to go. Prabhat Patnaik has calculated that a framework of universal social rights of the kind that we spoke about would cost us maybe an additional 10% of GDP. That we would raise taxes even if to 24%, although some of it would come back through the multiplier effect. But even if you say a tax to GDP ratio of 24%, it's about what the United States has. And a wealth tax, the Oxfam report itself said that a tax of just 1.5% on the wealth of dollar billionaires around the world is more than enough to ensure that there's decent education for all, healthcare for all, and so on and so forth. I think when we look at and assess neoliberalism now, it's useful to remember Gandhiji's talisman. Think of the most disadvantaged person you know, and think of whether what we are doing would benefit her. If we had held the talisman in his hand, our Prime Minister could never have called for a nationwide lockdown of the kind with the totality and cruelty. If he had really thought about what it would do to India's poorest. And finally, the idea of social protection and universal social rights, what does it really mean in the end? Noam Chomsky, one of the world's leading intellectuals, said social protection is ultimately the idea that we should take care of each other. And I think there can be no more beautiful and succinct articulation of what we are talking about. We have to build a society and a state in which we take care of each other. And the time for that has long been overdue. if we don't learn from the catastrophe of human suffering that our response to COVID has laid bare before us, then I think future generations are not going to forgive us for being so absolutely bereft of public compassion. Thank you.
Thank you, Hershey. That's very powerful, and just what you were saying in terms of particularly the resources not being available, the completely false argument that's built. The Panama Papers, now the Pandora Papers, are again telling us that there are resources, and as you said, if Prabhat Patnaik is saying it's 24%. If I remember correctly, then Canada, Sweden, Norway, they're all in their 40s, not just 24%, way ahead of us. If I remember correctly, I think Brazil, Mexico would be also in that range of 24%, which are our peers from BRICS. So thank you, and I think the minimum floor of dignity and universal social protection is really the big message coming from you. And ultimately, how do we root it also in the framework of compassion as a central pillar? Thank you so much. Can I request Mr. Raju now?
Thank you, Mr. Amitabh. Am I audible?
Yes, very well.
Okay. I just would like to highlight the single most challenge the country is now facing. That is to save our constitution. I think the kind of vision that you have articulated or Harsh has articulated will not become possible unless we are able to save the constitution that we have given to others, to our people. Because today the constitution is threatened and the constitution values are totally demolished, attacked. Why? Because the current dispensation at the center has not been an active player or a participant or a partner in making the constitution, if you go into the history. The current dispensation at the center has not been the part of the freedom struggle which has shaped the values that has fed into the constitution. So the fundamental problem actually starts from that. There is no ownership of the constitution values by the current dispensation. But at the same time, the current dispensation at the center cannot do away with the constitution. So what they have found it easy to do is to demolish the constitutional institutions so that the constitution for a period of time will become redundant. That is what has been happening during the last 7 years. Every conceivable constitutional institutions have been hijacked. They have been rendered not useful. They have been totally captured. And also, there is a clear evidence that the media also is fully captured. And if you look at the deliberative forums that the Constitution has given to us, whether state assemblies or the parliament, these deliberative assemblies, forums have stopped functioning. The way the legislations are discussed and passed, we are seeing that there is hardly any discussion. The way the budget is discussed, people do not know where the budget is going, what is the expected outcome of the budgetary items. Nothing of that is happening in the parliament. So, and the constitutional institutions, they are also totally become silent. So, I think the civil society collectively addresses this fundamental challenge as how to save the constitution. We will not be able to really expand the rights. We will not be able to actualize the rights given to the citizens. So that is where I feel that apart from the civil society, activism, civil society exposing these fault lines, there is a dire need for educating the people as to what kind of government we are electing, what kind of institutions that are growing and functioning. Then only there will be some element of change of direction towards protecting our constitution. Today, the fundamental right to expression is also curtailed. We have seen how the agitating farmers against the black farm laws, the kind of violence that was unleashed to them. And when the political parties try to visit the families of the victims, the way they were prevented, all these things show that there is a deliberate attempt to kind of silence the voice, the deliberate attempt to prevent you from expressing your views. This is something that is the biggest danger that we need to really address. The second issue I would like to flag is the plight of the marginalized sections, scheduled caste, scheduled tribes. For scheduled caste and scheduled tribes, it is the constitution that really gives them the rights. When the constitution is at stake, their fundamental rights, their dignity is also is seriously jeopardized. The present government has least concern about the disparities between the scheduled caste, scheduled tribes when compared to the rest of the society. There used to be a very sound policy of central government assessing what are the gaps between the scheduled caste, scheduled tribes when compared to rest of the society on various developmental parameters, and come up with the plans to accelerate the development of scheduled caste and scheduled tribes so that the gaps between them when compared to rest of the society are bridged on various developmental parameters, whether it is education, access to health, housing, livelihoods, employment, and all these parameters. The state was supposed to be conscious of what are the gaps between these marginalized sections when compared to the rest of the society, and put in budgetary resources to accelerate their development so that the gaps between them is bridged. That fundamental policy to bring in equity in the society by putting thrust on the development of SCs and STs, that whole policy has been dumped by the present dispensation. There is no discourse in the country. Nowhere in the country there is a discussion on these gaps in the development. There is no estimation of gaps in development. There is no public outcry on the gaps in these developments and demand for bridging these gaps. So that is one area that we need to really look at. And at a society level also, I think the fundamental to the question of scheduled caste is the caste system. That there is no discourse, there is no debate on what are the measures that need to be taken to annihilate the caste. We don't hear the discussion on annihilation of caste. The societies seem to have taken caste for granted. The societies seem to have come to a conclusion that caste is something that cannot be annihilated. But unless caste is annihilated, these hierarchies will not go, and the equity in the society cannot be achieved. So that fundamental question needs to be addressed. Finally, I find apart from looking at the rights-based paradigm, Amitabh, you are right when you observe that while pursuing our endeavor for expanding the boundaries of rights-based paradigm, there was total neglect of what is happening at a micro level. I think it is time has come for us to give equal focus at the when I meant to say that we ignored what is happening at the macro level, the macro economy, the kind of macro economy, how it is uh, working on the ground, how it is resulting in these kind of inequities, how it is depriving certain sections of society. There was no discussion or debate in the political parties on the macroeconomic policies and its imminent impact on depriving certain sections of the society. And consequently, we are now seeing that every macroeconomic policy that the country has come to adopt, the society has taken for granted, everybody has accepted without questioning, which has very seriously impacted the lives, livelihoods of the poor people, which has brought in, it has widened the inequities, it has made lives of large sections of the poor very invisible. So that is something that the intellectuals, economists, policymakers, and the civil societies need to keep an eye on the macroeconomic, in what direction we are taking the economy. Those questions need to be raised. Otherwise, our efforts to endow the citizens with rights will not have any meaning. And finally, I would like to conclude by mentioning that in the pandemic, the plight of the urban poor that we have seen, it clearly shows that such a large section of the workforce were literally invisible to the planners and the policymakers. They were just invisible. So I think what is the need of the hour is to really recognize that we have forgotten them, and we need to understand their lives in the urban areas. We need to understand their uh, their vulnerabilities, and the policies need to be framed on those lines. Finally, the social security for the unorganized workers, there was a legislation in the year 2008 to provide for universal social security for the unorganized workers. Even after 12 years after that legislation, nothing really happened substantively to provide social security for the unorganized workers. And the present, the social security code passed by the parliament in 2019 has made the social security more complicated, impossible to implement. More implementing agencies were brought into picture, and hardly any financing was talked about in the code. So literally, the code is saying that there won't be any financial support for providing social security, and the mechanisms for providing social security are also are not clearly envisioned. So in the process, what is likely to happen is whatever social security that states have already put in place, they are also being jeopardized with this new paradigm. So in the name of expanding the rights of laborers through these codes, whatever rights the laborers used to earlier access, they are being taken away. That is something that we need to really look at. And what was a matter of concern is when these codes were passed, the Social Security Code in 2019 and the remaining three codes in 2020, there was hardly any uproar in the society. There was hardly any discussion in the media also. So that only shows that these people on whose sweat and blood the economy is built are becoming invisible. So we need to recognize that, and we need to really bring them to the light, and we need to understand what are the macroeconomic paradigm that will address their concerns and their aspirations. Thank you.
Many thanks, Mr. Raju. Again, some very, very critical points for us, as in we're looking at rights, but the larger question of defending the Constitution and defending the constitutional institutions And I would even say the constitutional morality that we talk of, just the preamble itself, is probably the most central struggle at the moment, and all the others would feed into that struggle, but that's probably the most critical question. And the second that you're also talking of the marginalized sections, and particularly how in the public domain also discussions about even developmental deficits are not happening. Annihilation of caste is certainly, it's been kind of wiped out, but even the deficits of development have really not been discussed. That's not being addressed. And the final question that you're asking, particularly around the social security, I think that's also an interesting question for all of us. That enactment of rights and the realization of rights, there's a fairly long journey. How do we ensure the realization of rights for the last person that Harshji reminded us of, the Gandhiji's talisman? Because we have a plethora of rights. How do we ensure that the entitlements actually are there with the most marginalized? That's also a central question. And thank you also for reinforcing the macroeconomic structures and the trajectory. Nikhil, can I request you to go next? Suddenly we've again lost your visual. I don't know why, but we can hear you well, but we were seeing you well also earlier. But at this moment, at least I can't see you. I'm not sure of others, but I can't.
Nobody can see me. Oh, that's a pity. I can see myself, so I never got to know when I dropped off. But anyway,
please
so
go
I'll
ahead.
just speak then, I think, if that's okay.
We hear you well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you hear me okay? Yeah, there's not much in my face, so it's fine. I think what I'd like to start off by saying is I'll kind of personalize this in terms of my own journey. That I started work towards the mid and late 80s, and MKSS, which is the organization with which I have spent the bulk of my period of time of work, which is the Mazdoor Kisan Shakti Sangathan, was formed on the 1st of May 1990. And our work that preceded that, about 3 years before that, in that area that we worked. Now that was a time, so I think from that period onwards, if I would evaluate it, it has been one hostile wave after another, mostly, with a slight blip in between. And if we were to talk about neoliberal globalization, that was sort of when its great idea of hope was sweeping right across. So what made us form an organization called Mazdoor Kisan Shakti Sangathan on the 1st of May 1990? It's when communism was collapsing right across the world. It's when the free market was held out as this great panacea for everything, that the state could and would not be able to provide anything, and it had been shown as being the god that failed, and the god that would work was going to be the market and the free market. And in the midst of that, in one little part of central Rajasthan, you have a small independent organization coming up. And to me, looking back on that, it is because those sets of people found nothing of any value in that free market discourse. They were large numbers of people. They were completely left out of this whole free market thing. And it's not that they necessarily had seen the fruits of communism or socialism either, because I think if I look back again at the period when I started this work, there was very little that the very poor, I mean, they were very unorganized. There were pockets of organized labor where mill workers were and others were, and these were sets of people who were still benefiting from democracy, certainly coming out of a kind of extreme form of feudal control, but they were beginning to organize themselves, and that just continued. And therefore, to me, we started in our area with those traditional issues of peasants and workers in terms of land and minimum wages. And because of our times, out of those issues came the right to information. Out of those issues came a kind of a discourse that has lasted the next 30 years for us. that you said that actually because this neoliberal framework claimed to have great transparency, claimed that the market would bring in a whole lot of areas that democracy itself could survive along with capitalism. And those were the things that people had to latch on to. And therefore, they started saying, okay, let us use transparency to show what is actually there in what is supposed to be provided to people. So the slogans even of Hamara Paisa, Hamara Hisab, our money, our accounts, was to lay claim to that money in a democratic framework, because that's what they could latch on to. And therefore, the legitimacy came because everything else talking about socialism had been delegitimized, and people still had their eye very clearly on issues of equality and social, economic, and political equality. And I think that is something that will last through the ages. It's not something that I think we package it differently. We talk about our ideology in different forms. But looking back on it, people have always wanted social equality, they've always wanted economic equality, and they've always wanted political equality. But it's what they can hang on to at a particular time, and how creative and how powerful they can be. Because they are the ones who came up with saying, okay, this is what we have to fight for, and be able to make it available, to be able to expose how much one section and segment of society is actually doing away with whatever little that people have, and to hang on to it. And therefore, if you see between the period of 1990 and 2000, when neoliberal globalization was supposed to make India shine, when you come to a period of 2000, around 2004, 2005, that election which everyone in middle class India thought would actually go with India shining. In fact, even the rest of the people surprised themselves by finding out that actually did not find so much in it. And you had that period when the rights-based laws started to come in. So from 2005, the period when Harsh and Raju and that particular bit of space within government that was there to respond to this voice from people saying that we are actually facing extreme forms of misery and extreme forms of unhappiness, and to the extent possible, they were organizing, they were articulating. So they were articulating both these laws, if we look at them, the Right to Information and and the Employment Guarantee Act. I'd like to look at it in terms of kind of an intersectionality. That the Employment Guarantee Act, and even if Mr. Raju recalls, first went actually within Government of India to the Labour Ministry. And because the Labour Ministry had got completely delegitimized, labour rights were getting delegitimized, the neoliberal framework said nothing, there was no chance for anything. They started hanging on to citizenship rights. So actually NREG is a very interesting combination of labour rights and citizenship rights. It says everyone should get a right to work. It says everyone should get the right to minimum wages. It says, but it brings in the labour discourse by saying there should be a right to organize. Where you have people organizing, and we know in our own area, where there are unionizing of Narega workers and even women who have never been in the workforce, it's extraordinary how much they manage to achieve and how much they manage to fight, even amongst all the other groups. So this kind of combination of economic and political and social rights within NREG, because NREG does actually reach out to Dalits, to women more than any other time on the labor side. And if you look at RTI, again, the articulation from people, it was not an esoteric right that was fought for by the upper class or by the literate class, or it was not out of Article 19(1)(a) of the Constitution in terms of freedom of expression. It was the right to life, Article 21. It was hum janenge, hum jiyenge. It was out of equality, say who has all the grain and who doesn't, who has the resources and who doesn't. And therefore, right to information became a part of what Mr. Shankaran called a transformatory right. It attached itself onto every other battle, whether it was an economic battle or a social battle or a political battle. It became an intersectional issue. And that's what has made it so powerful and what's made it last. Now we have had a pushback against that brief period where we had 10 laws. I don't think just the RTI and NREGA. The Forest Rights Act is an extraordinary one. You cannot make it go down. You can't. You have had amendments against the right to information. You talked about the hollowing of rights, yes, but you have still had a parallel, very powerful movement on NREGA, which lasted right through, on the right to food, which lasted right through COVID and its attack. And these are the ones that have saved people to whatever extent, even the last people that Harsh has talked about. And they've saved it because people are actually invested in those particular rights. And the right to information also, even today, there's 7 to 8 million users for that, and every right, there are still people being killed, it's still being fought. Every individual battle on a right RTI battle is extraordinary, even though the government wants to undermine the law. So it's beyond the law, it's transcended the law. And therefore, I think just by giving these two examples, the kind of intersectionality that people have put into the rights-based approach is something we need to understand, and they're invested in it. They're fighting it. Now, of course, there is a big, very powerful right-wing, almost fascist in many places kind of group coming in, hollowing out democracy itself. And you cannot fight for your rights without a democratic framework. And therefore, what Mr. Raju said, I think on the side of political rights, we have had the complete hollowing out of our democratic framework. All our independent institutions are hollowed out. Everything except just the technicality of the right to vote is being hollowed out. But what was hollowed out much earlier, right, all through, I think, was the directive principles of state policy. From the time that we passed it, it is something we have never done anything more than pay lip service to. So actually, right to education, right to food, right to employment, right to health could have only matured if we had gone with the DPSP, the Directive Principles of State Policy. And they were never actually the Directive Principles of State Policy. And crony capitalism had a long, long history in the Congress Party and everyone else. And they are the ones who have taken over on that side where people are trying to fight. So I think what I'd like to say that today the Constitution, even though the ruling party is paying lip service to it, it's become a de facto contested space. In many ways, the areas of if you want to call it a welfare state, that has already been severely undermined because the DPSP was already undermined, and because the only ones we are surviving with are those rights-based laws where people were invested. Otherwise, they are completely whittling down, and even that is under attack, but it's still surviving. And the contested spaces where we did have some amount of freedom of expression, that is under very severe attack. But as you said, it is people who are fighting back, and people will continue to fight back. And I don't think that they are, I think they are so much under attack. They have been so much under attack. The kinds of people that I have certainly lived with have always been at the edge of survival. And it is now that you have this pernicious mix of religion and politics that has been deliberately brought in, that makes it something that I think a lot of us just do not know how to deal with. We have grown up in our country with a framework where at least this was considered by all to be something that you would not play with, completely destroying society post-independence. I think pre-independence it was there for a while, but post-independence it was considered that you would not have legitimacy to do that the way that the ruling party and its clique has. And that is something that threatens the framework, the constitutional framework that Mr. Raju says. It threatens our being able to give any kind of help that Harsh says for the last person with dignity, because the last person with dignity under attack today is that minority. It is not just the person who is economically badly off. It's that minority who has lost any kind of legitimacy to be able to fight and to say that what you're doing is not on. So I think last thing I'd like to end with is, Amitabh, your own, what you talked about, equality and inequality. It is just completely horrible. The fact that today, you talked about the 11 people, and your own report brought out the Oxfam Inequality report about the 13 lakh crores that was earned by the billionaires of India, the top 100 or whatever, which could run NREG for 10 years. But last year, Gautam Adani is supposed to have what his income from 1,20,000 crores to 5,80,000 crores, figures that have just come out day before yesterday. How can people possibly survive? How can the earth survive? How can a country like India survive? And in just to make some kind of some kind of polarized unity, you are throwing matchboxes, you're lighting fires of polarization right across the country. So I think to us, it is something that we don't have a clear answer to. We still have our people who are still organizing in parallel. And it's not like today, I would say in the areas where we are stronger than we have been before. But the forces against us are much, much stronger and much, much more pernicious and much, much more vicious in what they want to do. And I think to that we have no real answer.
Thank you, Nikhil, and thank you for also bringing in hope in terms of not certainly at the end, but what you've been saying. I think it's very important where people are invested, where people have owned the rights. Those rights have become in some ways inalienable, and they're fighting for it. They're defending it, and it is even for a hostile regime, an extremely hostile regime, it's not going to be easy to take away those rights. I think that's very, very powerful, and for us to kind of constantly go back to, because that certainly is inspiring. And the second idea that I've noted is the whole idea of intersectionality of rights, which is so critical. And you actually talked of the lived experience of how it worked. The third, I think, which is very important, is we have not adequately looked at the transformational rights that you talk of, how RTI was able to play that role. What are those other rights? I think it's also important to start thinking about that. And was a creation of Gram Sabhas, direct democracy spaces, was that the possibility of that transformational space? But we need to certainly look at that. And then I think the point that you're making is, for me, very, very important, is that the complete collapse of at least the normative consensus that we had post-independence, whether people lived by it or not, but at least there was a consensus, apparent consensus around it, and that's collapsed. And then you're looking at a contested space at multiple levels, and Mr. Raju also talked about it. So thank you, Nikhil, thank you, Harshji, thank you, Mr. Raju. I'm not sure how we take questions. We have around 15-20 minutes, so can we just quickly, if somebody could help me, because I see almost 280 people as participating in this conversation. But when I see the question answer, then I have only 5-6 people. I see Sam, you have a question. So would you want to articulate it? I don't know if you can actually unmute yourself or... Yes, Sam, I can see you.
Yes.
So if you just, go ahead.
Great. Okay, great. Yeah, thank you for the talk. I learned an enormous amount. I'm in the United States, so hearing the experiences, your experiences and the on-the-ground realities, unfortunately, many resonate to the same things that we're experiencing here in the United States in terms of the extreme inequality, the lack of concern for people, and the polarization and nationalism, and bringing politics and religion and all of these things together in a way that is frightening. So I felt a lot of solidarity, desire listening to you. One of the things that is hopeful to me, and I've been hearing it in some of the conversations here, is the amount of attention that people are paying now to the monetary systems, in particular the way in which money is created, and the way that the coronavirus relief efforts and the quantitative easing and all of these things revealed that there is an ability to create additional monetary counting units, for things that are needed and are important. And more people here and in Europe, I'm seeing during this conference, are focusing on seizing that power, whether it's talking about modern monetary theory or a jobs guarantee that we funded with debt-free money from the Treasury. And I'm just curious to know, is that conversation also happening in India?
Great. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Sam. So, do we have other questions? Because I went to the question and answer column, and this is the only question I see from Sam. This is certainly for me a fairly challenging technological platform. But so, if anybody could tell me if there's some questions anywhere else. So all of you are smiling. I'm not sure if you can see any other questions. Okay, so let's just take this question, and if there are any other comments that you would like to make after listening to each other, and yeah, we can then conclude. So maybe see this as some concluding thoughts from you. So let's go back in the same order, Harshji.
Amitabh, do you have any questions?
So yeah, so I think you've kind of responded to the questions I had, because in a way I also feel what's already been said, that at this moment it is really the battle for democracy, and we'll not without that battle. I think a lot of these rights will get hollowed out. And even in this context, as Nikhil is saying, where does the real energy come from? It is going to be from the people who are fighting their real battles for survival and dignity. So that's something fairly important for us. And you, Hershey, have already talked of even some formulations of how do we move ahead. So whether it's the idea of minimum floor of dignity, universal social rights, so there is a framework that we have. I would be certainly keen to hear from all three of you that how do we actually strengthen the battle for the democratic morality that we are talking of.
Yeah, there's so much to continue in this discussion. I liked many things that were said, but I wanted to hold on to Raju's observation that ultimately this is a battle about the constitution itself, and about Nikhil saying that we're trying to defend the rights of the poorest at a time when identities are being attacked in a way that we have not seen since independence. And I think that I'm very happy that these 2 points were made. I think that at one level, many people ask me, can you sort of briefly tell us how do we fight, the total destruction of democracy and the constitution that we see happening around us in India today. And people often think about this as something that can be fought in a strategic kind of, with electoral cunning. We get the alliances right between political parties. We're clever about what we say and what we don't say. But I don't agree at all. I think that this is a very critical civilizational movement. And it's not, when I say this, many people's eyes glaze over that, oh, this is sort of impractical idealism and we want sort of practical stuff here. But I think I wanted to remind people that it was actually ordinary people themselves during the anti-CAA protests, which was the largest public peaceful uprising that we've seen since independence, where they spontaneously made the constitution the icon of the struggle. And I think that they have understood something more than many of us who are sort of intellectuals and so on have understood, that there's something so fundamental that was promised in the Constitution. And what was it? It was justice for all. It was the freedom to practice one's faith, freedom to dissent, and the idea of the equal worth and dignity of every human being. And I think, most importantly, I was speaking in a public lecture a few days ago on Gandhiji's birthday, saying that to me, and not just to me, the core and the most forgotten idea, and probably the most difficult idea of the Constitution is the idea of fraternity. The idea that we are bound to and with each other. Dr. Ambedkar had said that why it is fundamental, it is the most fundamental idea of the Constitution, is that justice, liberty, equality can be achieved without fraternity, but then we need the force of the state. But if we have fraternity, then it's a society in which justice for all, freedom for all, and equality becomes a natural order of things. And I think that what I did want to say is that this battle has to be fought against the state. It has to be fought against crony capitalism, against the policies that we are seeing around us. But in the end, it's a battle that we have to fight with ourselves. It is in society that we will accomplish a framework of lived fraternity. It is only in that we can then reconceptualize an economic model. Sam was talking a little about how much resonance what we were talking about has with the United States. And I think across the world we're seeing a system which valorizes, and leaders coming up which valorize inequality and markets, but even more so, it's become around the world the most dangerous time in recent history to be a minority anywhere in the world. And I think it's addressing these questions as society that I wanted to just suggest that it's the problem is, one problem is out there, the three problems are pointing towards us. And I think we must remember how, and it is these battles that we'll have to fight in our own families, among our friends, in our workplaces, in the discourse that we have on social media. It is here that these battles need to be fought, and there's no other shortcut to this.
Thank you, Harji. Rajuji.
Yeah, I think any discussion on democracy should really look at our electoral systems in place. I think there is a huge fault line that needs to be addressed. Today, the way the elections happen, the way the candidates spend money to contest, like for example, ordinary people who have that sense of service to the society, he cannot imagine to contest an election and win unless he has the money. So whole lot of electoral reforms have to happen. Otherwise, I have a feeling that the right to vote, the universal franchise that Constitution has given the people, has been actually purchased by the capitalists, by the rich people. They buy the votes. They influence the electoral outcomes. So the role of money is something that we need to really address. Unless that is cleansed, we will not be able to really save our democracy. That is an agenda that we need to really look at. Not much is being talked about it. That is very fundamental. The second, equally important, is the processes that democratic institutions are following in bringing out the policies or legislations. Here I recollect the way the National Advisory Council used to look at public policy, the kind of consultations the NAC used to do with all the stakeholders, with the state governments, with the NGOs, with the technocrats, experts, and recommend to the government. Very wide consultations used to happen. But today I find no such wider consultations do happen at any level when a policy is formulated or when a legislation is formulated, introduced in the cabinet and passed in the parliament. So, lot of pre-legislative consultations need to be mandated, like in some other Western countries. So that is another reform that would engage the people in conversation. They will actually participate in the policy making. Otherwise, they don't feel that they are part of the governance process. So that is another important area that we need to look at to really protect the values of democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajuji. Nikhil?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, firstly, on the question that Sam has asked, I think both Sam's question and some of the things that we are addressing at on a macro level, to me, actually, the inequalities that exist are just so enormous and they are growing so much more that that same bit there where you speak about Ambedkar and where Harsh speaks about Ambedkar talking about fraternity being important and being a natural order of things, and otherwise a constable having to enforce it. Just before that is where Ambedkar talks about our social and economic inequalities being able to blow up this entire structure, which is where you can have this combination of liberty, equality, fraternity, in a social democracy. I think, to my mind, the inequalities have just grown more and more, and it is at a point really where that political democracy is under threat because we manage that political democracy, and it is extremely important. And Mr. Raju, to me, it's not electoral reforms anymore. If you have someone with so much money that they will play any electoral system because they really have the capacity to buy over every single voter, every single party, one opposition, whether it's one or three oppositions, all of them together. And it is really where they have purchased our entire electoral system. So it's not a question of putting one law in place or the other. They are capable of working their way around anything and everything. And therefore, we are at a point where we have to be able to address these enormous inequalities that exist. And I think, to my mind, that's why even this question of that Sam asked, that macroeconomics and monetary systemic reform, I think the battle that we'll see is between these massive big capitalist forces. It's just between them. The rest of us have nothing to do in that. They are the ones who are completely, it is crony capitalism where the battle is only between one group and the other. And government is finding itself trying to please one force or the other. And this is what one kind of sees. In parallel, I think we have to see, in a sense, that what will people do? We go back to that no matter what, people are still, they have gone through a certain number of years of a certain kind of democratic culture being built. I think caste has been fought very, very powerfully over the last 70 years in many, many ways and against impossible odds. And I think huge changes have been seen in that. I think even on the question where we had something as terrible as the Citizenship Amendment Act, it was fought by Muslim women, by Muslims all over, and a set of people who did not see this as something that was legitimate and should happen. I think that's somewhere out of people just not willing to accept this lot that is exploiting it is 99% versus 1%. It is when those 99% manage to forge some kind of idea of solidarity and fraternity that we will see something, and that's not immediately on the horizon. But how quickly it can come, I don't think we can imagine that. It can come because there is literally a 1% versus a 99%. It's just not happening. And maybe none of us can engineer it. Maybe all of us can only keep trying to keep those forces going that have been positive towards these ideas of equality and social democracy.
Thank you, Nikhil. and uh, it's been really a stimulating conversation. Sam, my very brief response to what you said, or the question that you asked, would be that I do think that there's a very, very robust opposition and defense for the constitutional morality, for the constitution that we have, certainly at the level of ideas, and people are struggling. But unfortunately, at the macroeconomic level or macroeconomic questions, we still do not have very robust responses. It almost seems like there is a consensus, and there are very few people who are willing to challenge that. And that itself is a problem. I do think that moving ahead, our democratic struggle is going to be incomplete if we do not look at alternative macroeconomic conceptions. So it's not going to work, because I do feel that this assault on democracy is also part of the market fundamentalism and the moment of neoliberalism we are in, the inequality that we are all talking of. So at this moment, if we don't look at real macro alternatives of how we organize our economics, it's unlikely that our democratic battles would succeed. So that's my response, and in some ways, it's not happening adequately in India at the moment. But we do need to think about it. So thanks, Sam, for that, and thank you, Harshji, Rajuji, Nikhil, for very, very stimulating conversation. Certainly helps us think together about what could be some of the next steps. Gives me hope. And let me again thank the Global Forum, Professor Neera Chandok, Pushpraj, and Samruddh Bharat Foundation. Thank you, and friends who've joined in into this conversation. Grateful. Bye bye. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.